Lord Peter Wimsey paused in the act of extracting his cigarette case to regard the brass nameplate on the solicitor's door with the sort of pained expression typically reserved for witnessing crimes against the English language. The offending inscription read, "Mervyn Pargeter, Esquire, Solicitor and Commissioner for Oaths. I say, Bunter," he murmured to his manservant, who stood with characteristic patience beneath the dripping eaves of the Tudor-fronted building. "One does rather hope that Mr. Pargeter's legal expertise exceeds his orthographical accomplishments. A solicitor who cannot spell his own profession does rather suggest a certain want of attention to detail." "Indeed, my lord," Bunter replied, with the diplomatic neutrality he had perfected over years of service. "Though perhaps the engraver was at fault. Charitable of you, Bunter, but observe the patina. That plate has weathered at least 3 winters. One would have thought professional pride, if not client confidence, might have prompted a correction by now." Wimsey adjusted his monocle and knocked briskly upon the door. Still, one mustn't judge too harshly. After all, the man did have the good sense to summon us to Little Zodiac, and any village with such a delightfully pretentious name is bound to provide adequate compensation for minor lapses in literacy. The door opened to reveal Mr. Mervyn Pargeter himself, a neat, anxious man of middle years, whose thinning hair and worried expression suggested someone perpetually braced for bad news. His pale eyes darted between Wimsey and Bunter with the desperate relief of a drowning man spotting a life-preserver. "Lord Peter, thank heavens you've come. I scarcely dared hope, that is to say, when I received your telegram confirming your arrival, I could hardly believe. Oh, do come in, both of you. Such a ghastly business, absolutely ghastly." They were ushered into a sitting room that bore all the hallmarks of a provincial legal practice: leather-bound volumes of case law, a desk buried beneath neat stacks of documents tied with red ribbon, and the sort of furniture that had been chosen more for its appearance of respectability than actual comfort. A coal fire struggled against the October chill, casting flickering shadows that seemed to emphasize rather than dispel the room's underlying gloom. "I trust," said Wimsey, settling himself into a chair that creaked ominously under his weight, "that the deceased had the courtesy to expire in an appropriately mysterious fashion. One does so hate to travel all this way for a straightforward poisoning or a mundane bludgeoning." Pargeter's hands fluttered nervously. "Oh, most mysterious indeed, my lord. Most thoroughly mysterious. Poor Professor Blackwood found dead in his locked study this morning. Not a mark upon him, with the most extraordinary expression of terror frozen upon his face. And the letters, of course, the dreadful letters." "Ah, letters." Wimsey's grey eyes sharpened with interest. "How delightfully epistolary. One does hope they were properly sealed and addressed. There's nothing quite so disappointing as anonymous correspondence that lacks proper attention to postal etiquette." They were indeed properly addressed. "My lord," though their contents, Pargeter shuddered delicately, 12 letters in total, delivered over the past fortnight to various residents of the village. Each contained what appeared to be an elaborate horoscope, accompanied by the most unsettling predictions. The newspapers have dubbed the sender the Zodiac Killer, though until this morning we had no actual killing to speak of. And now you do. How obliging of someone to fulfill the newspaper's dramatic expectations." Wimsey lit his cigarette and regarded Pargeter through the smoke. "Tell me, what was Professor Blackwood's particular field of expertise? I assume he was sufficiently scholarly to warrant the title." "Astronomical mathematics, primarily, though he had recently become fascinated by the historical development of astrological symbolism. He was writing a book. You see something about the corruption of ancient astronomical knowledge by medieval superstition. Rather dry stuff, I'm told, but he seemed quite passionate about it. Passionate enough to die for it, apparently." Wimsey rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the grey October afternoon. The village of Little Zodiac spread before him like a particularly well-preserved specimen of English rural life. Thatched cottages clustered around a Norman church, winding lanes that had been laid out by medieval sheep rather than any rational planning authority, and the sort of carefully maintained quaintness that suggested a community more concerned with appearances than with the darker realities that might lurk beneath its picturesque surface. "I don't suppose," he said thoughtfully, "that the professor had any particular enemies. Academic rivalries can be surprisingly vicious. I've known scholars to commit murder over a disputed footnote." Pargeter shifted uncomfortably. "Well, he wasn't what one might call popular. Rather sharp-tongued, you know, and he had a talent for making others feel foolish. He'd been particularly caustic lately about what he called astrological charlatanism, wrote several rather scathing letters to the Times about fortune-tellers and such nonsense. Ah, a rationalist crusader. How refreshing, and how dangerous." Whimsy turned back from the window. "These mysterious letters, I assume they've been preserved for our inspection." "Inspector Grimsby has them, my lord. He's at Blackwood House now, examining the scene. A thorough man, though perhaps not entirely equipped for a case of this complexity." Before Whimsy could respond, the sound of heavy boots on the front step announced the arrival of Inspector Grimsby himself. The inspector was a solid, methodical man who approached crime with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to his prize vegetable garden. He had worked with Whimsy before and had learned to regard the amateur detective's eccentric methods with a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect. "Ah, Lord Peter," Grimsby said as he entered, removing his wet mackintosh and hanging it carefully on the back of a chair. "I rather thought you might turn up. Nothing like a good impossible murder to bring you down from London. My dear Inspector, you malign me. I was merely passing through on my way to visit my great-aunt Hermione in Bath when Mr. Pargeter's telegram reached me. One thing led to another, as these things invariably do." Whimsy's expression was one of injured innocence. "Besides, I understand you have letters. I do so enjoy a good correspondence." Grimsby's expression suggested he found this explanation about as convincing as a politician's campaign promises, but he merely nodded. "Aye, we have letters right enough. 12 of them, all signed with different zodiacal symbols. Nasty things, full of predictions about death and disaster. And now we have Professor Blackwood dead in his locked study, with one of the blasted things pinned to his waistcoat." "Pinned, you say? How delightfully dramatic. With what sort of pin, if I may ask?" "Lady's hatpin, silver, with a rather ornate head shaped like a crescent moon. Found it driven right through the paper and into his chest, though it didn't kill him, no blood to speak of, and the pin barely penetrated the skin." Whimsy's eyebrows rose with genuine interest. "A crescent moon? How charmingly symbolic. And what did this particular epistle have to say?" "Something about the final conjunction, and when Saturn returns to his house." Gibberish, mostly, though it gave poor Mrs. Pemberton quite a turn when she read it. Mrs. Pemberton being the professor's housekeeper, found the body this morning when she came to prepare his breakfast. Poor woman still in a state of collapse. Whimsy rose and moved toward the door. "Then we must certainly pay our respects to the grieving Mrs. Pemberton, and, of course, to the late Professor Blackwood himself. One should never keep a corpse waiting, it's frightfully bad manners." As they prepared to leave for Blackwood House, Whimsy paused to examine Pargeter's brass nameplate once more. "I say, Pargeter, you really must have that corrected. In a case involving astronomical precision and astrological symbolism, one cannot afford to be careless about spelling. The stars, after all, are notorious sticklers for accuracy, and with that characteristically oblique observation, Lord Peter Whimsy set out to unravel what would prove to be one of the most peculiar cases of his detecting career, a mystery that would lead him deep into the shadowy intersection of ancient wisdom and modern malice, where the movements of celestial bodies provided cover for very terrestrial crimes. The wind that had worried the village all morning seemed to whisper secrets as they made their way through the narrow lanes toward Blackwood House, and Whimsy found himself wondering whether the stars that had so fascinated the late professor might indeed have something to say about the circumstances of his death, though he suspected the truth would prove to be rather more earthbound than celestial. Blackwood House revealed itself through the dripping yews as one of those architectural compromises that occur when successive generations each insist upon leaving their mark. A Tudor core had been enthusiastically embellished by Georgian sensibilities, which in turn had been subjected to Victorian Gothic revival enthusiasms. The result was a house that seemed to crouch among its overgrown gardens like a scholar who had put on too many academic gowns at once. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall struck 2:30 as they entered, though Inspector Grimsby's pocket watch insisted it was only 20 minutes past. Whimsy paused to regard this temporal discrepancy with the sort of pleased attention most people reserved for unexpected legacies. "How refreshingly anarchic," he murmured to Bunter, "a house where time itself refuses to conform to convention." One begins to understand why the professor found astronomical precision so appealing. Mrs. Pemberton descended upon them with the determined efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years managing other people's domestic crises. She was a woman of perhaps 50, dressed in uncompromising black, with the sort of rigidly controlled demeanor that suggested she regarded emotional displays as a form of poor housekeeping. "Such a shock, my lord," she said, executing a precise curtsy that somehow managed to convey both respect and barely contained hysteria. "In all my years of service, I've never encountered anything quite so irregular." Whimsy settled her into a chair with gentle authority. "Irregular circumstances do tend to disturb the domestic routine, Mrs. Pemberton. Perhaps you could tell us about this. Morning's events? I assume Professor Blackwood was a creature of habit?" "Oh yes, my lord. Most particular about his schedule. Breakfast at 8 sharp, morning post with his coffee, then straight to his study until luncheon. He insisted on absolute quiet during his working hours, wouldn't tolerate so much as a creaking floorboard. And this morning proved exceptional." Mrs. Pemberton's composure wavered slightly. "I knocked at the study door at 8:15, as was customary. No answer. Most unusual, my lord, the professor was never late for his meals. I tried the door, but it was locked from the inside, as always when he was working. When I used my key—" She pressed a handkerchief to her lips. "His face, my lord, such an expression of absolute terror. And that dreadful letter pinned to his waistcoat, with a rather distinctive hatpin, I'm told. Miss Cordelia's hatpin, my lord. The professor's niece, though they weren't on speaking terms. She visited last month, and there it was quite a scene. She left it behind, stuck in the hall table cushion." Whimsy's interest sharpened perceptibly. "Miss Astley had words with her uncle?" "Oh yes, my lord. Most unpleasant words. He called her a disgrace to the family name. Said she'd fallen in with fortune-tellers and crystal gazers. She left in quite a temper, declaring he was a narrow-minded old fool who wouldn't recognize genuine mystical insight if it struck him dead." Mrs. Pemberton paused, realizing the unfortunate implications of her words. "Begging your pardon, my lord. No apology necessary. Where might we find Miss Astley now?" "She has lodgings above Mrs. Wickham's tea shop in the village, my lord, though I believe she's been entertaining visitors of late. Gentlemen callers." The delicate emphasis suggested depths of moral disapproval that could have chilled the morning room by several degrees. Before Whimsy could pursue this intriguing line of inquiry, Inspector Grimsby cleared his throat meaningfully. "We should examine the scene, Lord Peter. The body's still in position." They proceeded down a corridor whose turkey carpet had developed ambitious little hills where the floorboards had settled. The study door stood open, its key still protruding from the inner lock like an accusatory finger. The room beyond was large and lined with books that looked genuinely used rather than merely decorative. An elaborate brass orrery occupied one corner, its miniature planets frozen in their eternal dance. Professor Blackwood lay beside his desk, face turned toward the ceiling, mouth slack and eyes horribly wide, as though the last thing he had seen had been of paramount importance. The letter pinned to his waistcoat bore the printed symbol of Capricorn above neat lines of type, secured by a silver hatpin whose crescent moonhead caught the weak autumn light. "No wound to speak of," Grimsby explained. "Doctor says heart failure, shock or fright. The pin barely penetrated the skin." Whimsy moved about the room with his characteristic absent-minded precision, lifting objects and peering at angles. "The windows?" "Latched tight, no marks on the sill, chimney too narrow for anything larger than a sparrow." "And the various timepieces?" Whimsy indicated a French mantel clock, adorned with a bronze Mercury, who seemed poised to abscond with the minute hand. "Set for 5 o'clock, like Mrs. Pemberton said. Stopped at 16 minutes past 1. while the hall clock maintains its own eccentric schedule. Fascinating. Whimsy approached the fireplace, where pale ash suggested recent burning. Something was consumed here last night. Paper, by the texture. Bunter, with the reverent touch of a man handling ecclesiastical vestments, examined the mantel clock. The pendulum weight has been recently adjusted, my lord. Rather crudely, the bell mechanism has been muffled with felt. One grows sentimental about the habits of bells, Whimsy observed. Mrs. Pemberton, did the professor often burn correspondence? Only those dreadful letters, my lord. He'd received 3 others over the past fortnight, each one more disturbing than the last. Threw them straight into the fire after reading them, muttering about medieval nonsense and dangerous charlatanism. Yet today's letter survived to provide such dramatic punctuation to his demise. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Gerald, the gardener, a solid man who carried the scent of earth and growing things, and the patient dignity of someone accustomed to coaxing life from reluctant soil. "You were about the grounds last night, Gerald?" Whimsy inquired. "Aye, my lord. Heard the weather vane cry out around 10 needs oiling, she does, when the wind's from the northeast. Then again near midnight, just a little cry like a caught rabbit. The lights went out in the back passage about then fuse box gave trouble. I fixed it direct. And the professor's study? Dark by then, my lord, but I heard the conservatory door around 11:10. Could have been the wind, mind. The parlour-maid, Millicent, appeared next, a slim, sulky girl whose pretty face had not yet learned that beauty improved by kindness. Her testimony about the professor's caustic tongue and the mysterious bell-pull failure added another layer to the evening's curious sequence of events. "Chalk marks under the study carpet," she mentioned with obvious reluctance. "The professor was particular about the rug's position. Said I was to forget what I'd seen when I knocked the corner whilst dusting." "Chalk marks," Whimsy repeated thoughtfully. "A meticulous gentleman indeed." As they concluded their examination, Whimsy opened the study window with a firm jerk. The catch stuck in a way that spoke of long disuse. A faint, sweetish odor drifted in with the damp air, not quite lavender, not quite anything identifiable. "That scent," he said to Mrs. Pemberton. "Do you recognize it?" She sniffed suspiciously. "Not a scent. I'd choose, my lord. Like those pastilles my Aunt Ruth burned for her catarrh." Whimsy nodded slowly, his grey eyes distant with thought. The locked room, the adjusted clock, the muffled bell, the mysterious chalk marks, the estranged niece with her distinctive hatpin, each element seemed to dance around some central truth that remained tantalizingly out of reach. "Inspector," he said finally, "I believe we must pay our respects to Miss Cordelia Astley. One should never keep a lady waiting, particularly one whose jewelry has become so intimately involved in the evening's entertainment." The wind that had worried the village all morning seemed to carry whispers as they prepared to leave Blackwood House, and Whimsy found himself wondering whether the stars that had so fascinated the late professor might indeed have something prophetic to say about the circumstances of his death, though he suspected the truth would prove rather more terrestrial than celestial. Mrs. Wickham's tea shop occupied the ground floor of a Tudor cottage that had been bullied into commercial respectability by the addition of lace curtains and a brass bell that announced each customer with the persistence of a debt collector. The proprietress herself, a woman of determined gentility, whose flour-dusted apron suggested she took her scones more seriously than her gossip, though both received considerable attention, greeted them with the sort of nervous flutter reserved for unexpected visits from the authorities. "Miss Astley is upstairs, my lord," she confided in a stage whisper that could have reached the gallery of the Lyceum. "Though I must say her recent habits have been most irregular. Gentlemen callers at all hours, and such peculiar conversations drifting through the floorboards. Something about planetary influences and spiritual emanations. Not what one expects from a properly brought-up young lady, if you take my meaning." The narrow staircase creaked its disapproval as they ascended, past windows whose diamond panes cast prismatic rainbows across whitewashed walls. At the landing, a brass nameplate proclaimed, "Miss C. Astley C. Astley, consultant in astrological sciences," in elaborate script that suggested pretensions to mystical authority. Miss Cordelia Astley proved to be a woman of perhaps 28, possessed of the sort of dramatic dark beauty that belonged in pre-Raphaelite paintings rather than provincial tea shops. Her flowing dress of deep purple velvet was adorned with an impressive collection of silver jewelry bearing various celestial symbols, and her sitting room had been transformed into what could only be described as a shrine to the zodiacal arts. Star charts covered every available wall space, crystal spheres occupied strategic positions to catch the afternoon light, and the air hung heavy with sandalwood incense that competed gamely with the more prosaic aroma of Mrs. Wickham's baking below. "Lord Peter Wimsey," she said, rising with fluid grace as they entered. "I wondered when you might appear." The stars suggested a visit from someone of significance, though Mercury's current retrograde made the timing somewhat uncertain. "How inconsiderate of Mercury," Wimsey replied with grave courtesy. "Though I suppose even planets must occasionally indulge in tardiness. We've come to discuss your uncle's rather dramatic departure from this mortal coil, Miss Astley. I understand you and Professor Blackwood had recently exchanged words of a somewhat heated nature." Cordelia's composure flickered, like candlelight, disturbed by an unexpected draught. Uncle Reginald was a brilliant man in his narrow way, but utterly closed to any understanding beyond empirical measurement. He viewed the universe as mere clockwork, devoid of soul or deeper meaning. When I tried to share my insights into the interconnected web of existence, the subtle energies that shape our destinies, he dismissed my work as superstitious drivel and my consultations as parlor, tricks for simpletons. Inspector Grimsby leaned forward with the patient persistence of a terrier-scenting rabbit. "And this disagreement became rather personal, I am told." "He threatened to disinherit me," Cordelia said, her chin lifting defiantly. "The family trust was meant to come to me upon his death, but he used it as leverage, a means of control. He said, if I didn't abandon my occult nonsense and pursue what he called a respectable career, he'd leave everything to the Royal Astronomical Society or some equally dusty institution." "A considerable sum?" Wimsey inquired with casual interest. "Nearly £8,000, she admitted. "Enough to establish a proper practice, to help others understand their cosmic destinies without worrying about rent and groceries." Grimsby's pencil scratched eagerly across his notebook. "And you were, shall we say, rather put out by this ultimatum?" I was furious. I told him he was a dried-up tyrant who wouldn't recognize genuine, spiritual truth if it struck him dead. Her eyes widened as she realized the unfortunate resonance of her own words. "Oh dear, that does sound rather prophetic, doesn't it?" Wimsey, meanwhile, had drifted toward a side table where several items caught his attention with the sort of casual precision that suggested nothing casual about it at all. "Charming timepiece," he observed, indicating a small brass clock whose face bore the 12 signs of the zodiac. "Swiss movement, unless I'm much mistaken. Recently cleaned, too, judging by the brightness of the mechanism. I believe in precision, Lord Peter. The stars operate according to exact celestial mechanics. One cannot cast accurate horoscopes with sloppy timekeeping. Indeed not, though I notice this particular clock runs approximately 7 minutes fast. An interesting choice for someone devoted to cosmic accuracy." Before Cordelia could respond, Bunter cleared his throat delicately. "Begging your pardon, miss, but I observe several star charts dated for last evening. The calculations appear to extend well past midnight, suggesting considerable late-night activity." "Spiritual work often requires extended hours," Cordelia said quickly. "When the cosmic influences align properly, one must be prepared to labor through the night." "Quite so," Wimsey murmured. "And, speaking of labor, Mrs. Pemberton mentioned that you left a rather distinctive hatpin behind after your last visit to Blackwood House. Silver, with a crescent moon head?" Cordelia's hand flew instinctively to her throat, where a similar ornament nestled among her other jewelry. "My moon goddess pin? Yes, I was so upset when I left that I must have forgotten it. I remember sticking it into the hall table cushion, meaning to retrieve it later." "It was found this morning," Grimsby announced, with barely concealed satisfaction. "Pinned to your uncle's waistcoat, securing one of those Zodiac letters to his body." The color drained from Cordelia's face with remarkable speed. "My pin? But that's impossible. Why would I use my own jewelry?" It points directly to me. Perhaps, Whimsy suggested gently, that was rather the point. One might almost suspect a deliberate attempt to implicate you, Miss Astley. After all, a genuine murderer would hardly leave such an obvious calling card. Unless, Grimsby countered, she thought herself clever enough to make it appear that someone else was trying to implicate her. A double bluff, as it were. Cordelia sank into her chair, suddenly looking far younger than her years. You really think I killed him? That I would stoop to such crude obviousness? I may have wished Uncle Reginald would open his eyes to greater truths, but I would never— Of course not, Whimsy said soothingly, though one does wonder about the curious coincidence of timing. Tell me, Miss Astley, do you happen to know anything about the adjustment of clock mechanisms, or perhaps the muffling of bells? I know nothing about such mechanical matters, she protested. My concerns are purely spiritual. Naturally, though I couldn't help noticing that charming little toolkit beside your astronomical charts. Quite professional-looking screwdrivers and such. One assumes they're for maintaining your various timepieces. As they prepared to leave, Whimsy paused at the window overlooking the village square. One final question, Miss Astley. This recent gentleman caller of yours, Mr. Sebastian Vale, I believe Mrs. Wickham mentioned. An astrologer himself? Sebastian is a true practitioner, Cordelia said, a note of warmth entering her voice for the first time. He understands that genuine mystical work requires discretion, subtlety. He despises theatrical nonsense. How refreshing. And where might we find Mr. Vale this afternoon? He's preparing for a lecture at the Assembly Room tomorrow evening. Something about the corruption of ancient wisdom by modern materialism. Rather appropriate, given recent events. As they descended Mrs. Wickham's creaking staircase, Whimsy's expression bore the satisfied air of a man who had gathered considerably more information than the conversation had ostensibly provided. The red herring had been duly presented, examined, and found to be exactly what it appeared, which, in Whimsy's experience, usually meant it was nothing of the sort. Inspector Grimsby, possessed of the admirable if limited virtue of directness, proposed an immediate confrontation with Mr. Sebastian Vale. Whimsy, however, had developed what he termed an appetite for the parish pump, observing that the purest waters of indiscretion invariably issued from such humble sources. Their first pilgrimage led them to Mr. Trapp's establishment, where the gentle symphony of ticking timepieces provided a soothing counterpoint to the day's more violent rhythms. Mr. Trapp, himself a thin gentleman, whose magnifying glass seemed permanently grafted to his temple, regarded them with the cautious courtesy of one accustomed to explaining time's various misbehaviors to an impatient world. Questions about clock modifications, he mused, polishing a brass mechanism with meditative precision. Indeed, my lord, there have been 2 recent inquiries of a most particular nature. A respectable lady housekeeper's bearing I'd venture purchased felt discs for muffling a mantel clock strike. Said the conversation of it troubled her employer's concentration. And the second inquiry? A gentleman of theatrical aspect, my lord. Soft hands, well-spoken, wearing a curious ring with some celestial device. He wished to know how one might silence a clock strike without stopping the movement entirely. I suggested baize wrapping for the bell mechanism, though I warned it would compromise the tone. Whimsy's grey eyes sharpened with interest. This gentleman, did he carry any particular fragrance? Mr. Trapp sniffed thoughtfully. Come to mention it, there was something foreign about his scent. Sweetish, like those pastilles ladies burn for respiratory complaints. The chemist's shop proved equally illuminating. Mr. Selby, who arranged his wares with pharmaceutical precision, confirmed a recent surge in demand for aromatic pastilles. Mrs. Pemberton purchased Friar's balsam for the professor's catarrh, he explained. And a theatrical gentleman, the same one, I suspect bought considerable quantities of sandalwood incense and benzoin resin, highly perfumed substances. I advised moderation, but he seemed quite determined. At the post office, Miss Briggs provided the final piece of their epistolary puzzle. The Zodiac letters were posted locally, my lord, though the typewriter ribbon was of superior quality. The addresses were remarkably neat, save for one stamp placed slightly askew. The gentleman who posted them hummed while I weighed his parcels, a curious melody with oriental inflections. Armed with this intelligence, they proceeded to the assembly rooms where Sebastian Vale was preparing for his evening lecture. The man himself proved to be a study in cultivated mysticism, dark hair touched with premature silver, expensive continental tailoring, and the sort of magnetic presence that suggested either genuine spiritual insight or considerable talent for profitable deception. "Lord Peter Wimsey," Vale said, rising from a table covered with astronomical charts, "your reputation precedes you, though I confess Mercury's retrograde gave me no warning of your visit." "How inconsiderate of Mercury," Wimsey replied, settling himself with feline precision. "We're investigating Professor Blackwood's rather dramatic departure from earthly concerns. I understand you knew the gentleman professionally." "Regrettably, yes. Professor Blackwood represented the most narrow materialism, a man who saw only mechanism where others perceived meaning. Our intellectual disagreements were legendary in certain circles. Before Wimsey could pursue this promising avenue, Dr. Thornfield arrived with his medical report. The physician, a solid, practical man whose training left little room for mystical speculation, confirmed their growing suspicions. "Heart failure, certainly," he announced, settling heavily into a chair. But induced by extreme terror, the expression on Blackwood's face suggested mortal fear of the most overwhelming sort. Whatever frightened him appeared suddenly and completely. "Any other observations, Doctor?" His clothing was disarranged, as though he'd started from his chair in alarm. And there was a peculiar odor about the body, medicinal, sweetish, rather like the pastilles my late wife used for her breathing difficulties. Vale had grown noticeably pale during this medical discourse. "Gentlemen, if you'll excuse me, I have considerable preparations." "Of course," Wimsey said agreeably, "though I wonder about this morning's letter, the one mentioning the final conjunction and Saturn's return. Rather specific astrological terminology." "Such phrases are common in mystical literature," Vale replied carefully. "Naturally, though the phrasing struck me as oddly familiar." Wimsey's gaze drifted to Vale's work table, where several draft documents lay partially concealed beneath astronomical charts. "I say, are those research materials? The paper quality appears quite distinctive, creamy texture, slight tooth to the finish. Rather like the Zodiac correspondence, wouldn't you agree, Inspector?" Grimsby examined the drafts with growing satisfaction. "Remarkably similar, my lord." Vale's composure flickered. "Merely academic research into historical precedents for anonymous astrological communications. A fascinating sociological phenomenon." "Indeed," Wimsey murmured, noting the man's obvious discomfort. "And your activities last evening? I assume preparation for tonight's lecture kept you occupied?" "Until the early hours, yes. I heard the village church bell strike midnight, then 1 o'clock, before retiring." "How curious. You didn't notice any unusual silence from the bells, or perhaps hear them strike 5 o'clock?" Vale frowned. "No unusual silence that I recall, and I was certainly asleep by 5. As they prepared to leave, Wimsey paused at the window overlooking the village square. "One does appreciate precision in all its forms, Mr. Vale. The careful adjustment of timepieces, the muffling of inconvenient sounds, the creation of perfect alibis. Though I've always found that the most elaborate deceptions often contain the seeds of their own destruction." Descending to the street, Inspector Grimsby could barely contain his satisfaction. "It's Vale, my lord. The evidence is overwhelming, the letters, the scents, the clock modifications. He's our Zodiac killer." Wimsey merely smiled with enigmatic amusement. "My dear Inspector, if only villainy were quite so obligingly transparent. Mr. Vale has certainly provided us with a most convenient collection of incriminating evidence, which, in my experience, usually suggests that the truth lies in rather more subtle directions." He glanced up at the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to assert themselves against the gathering dusk. "The celestial mechanics of little Zodiac, Bunter, appear to be considerably more complex than our theatrical friend would have us believe." The grey October morning that followed Professor Blackwood's dramatic departure from earthly concerns found Lord Peter Wimsey in a contemplative mood regarding the village of Little Zodiac, with the sort of methodical attention typically reserved for dissecting a particularly complex fugue. Over Mrs. Pemberton's austere but adequate breakfast, he announced his intention to audit the evening's chronology until it confessed its irregularities. Mrs. Pemberton, summoned with her household ledger and the resigned expression of one accustomed to explaining domestic routine to gentlemen who had never boiled water for themselves, provided the evening's skeletal framework with admirable precision. "Dinner served at 7:30 sharp, my lord," she began, consulting her notes with the gravity of a court stenographer. The professor seemed agitated, muttering about theatrical charlatans and dangerous medieval nonsense. He retired to his study immediately after, saying he had urgent correspondence to complete. At 9:15, I observed his lamp burning and heard the typewriter most unusual, as he typically composed by hand. Whimsy's eyebrows rose with interest. "The typewriter, you say? How delightfully modern of him." The professor had recently acquired it for his book manuscript, my lord. Said handwriting was becoming illegible with age. At 10:15, he rang the service bell, but when I responded, it wouldn't function properly. The wire seemed to have developed a fault. They proceeded to examine this allegedly faulty mechanism, which proved to be a masterpiece of deliberate sabotage. The servant bell board in the back passage revealed a length of wire, neatly looped and pinned against the frame by a carefully placed sliver of wood, far too precise for any accidental failure. "Someone desired silence at 10:15 precisely," Whimsy observed with satisfaction. The professor rang for assistance, but his message died here in the servants' corridor. Most considerate of our murderer, to ensure domestic tranquility. Returning to the study, they conducted a series of acoustic experiments that would have impressed the Royal Institution. Bunter positioned himself at various points throughout the house, while Whimsy tested the transmission of sound from the study. The results proved illuminating. The heavy curtains, wall-to-wall books, and solid oak door created a remarkably effective sound barrier. One could conduct a small orchestra in the hallway, Whimsy mused, without unduly disturbing the professor's cogitations, provided one avoided the more resonant floorboards. The conservatory door that Gerald had mentioned hearing proved equally instructive. Its ancient mechanism produced a distinctive groan when opened, not easily mistaken for wind or settling timbers. More significantly, the passage connecting it to the main house contained several particularly vocal floorboards that would announce any nocturnal visitor with the enthusiasm of a town crier. The chalk marks beneath the Turkish rug revealed themselves to be far more significant than mere housekeeping precision. When the heavy carpet was lifted, an elaborate grid of white lines emerged, not simple positioning guides, but a complex geometric pattern suggesting multiple, carefully measured relocations of furniture. "Observe, Bunter," Whimsy said, kneeling to trace the faint marks with a gloved finger. "These lines describe not one arrangement, but several. The desk has been moved at least twice, the chair repositioned multiple times. Someone has been conducting experiments in spatial relationships." The French mantel clock, still frozen at 16 minutes past 1, submitted to Bunter's expert examination. The mechanism had been deliberately stopped, not wound down naturally, but physically arrested. More intriguingly, the felt padding muffling its chime showed recent application, yet the clock had stopped before the padding would have been necessary. "The sequence troubles me, Bunter," Whimsy admitted. "If the clock was stopped at 1:16, why muffle it afterward? Unless, of course, the muffling served some entirely different purpose." Inspector Grimsby's return with Dr. Thornfield provided additional pieces to their chronological puzzle. The physician's more detailed examination confirmed that Professor Blackwood had died of shock-induced heart failure, his expression frozen in an attitude of absolute terror. "Whatever he saw appeared suddenly and completely," Dr. Thornfield explained. "The pupils were dilated, the heart showed extreme stress, a visual shock of overwhelming magnitude." This medical evidence, combined with their acoustic experiments, began to suggest a carefully orchestrated deception. The professor, isolated by his sabotaged bell system and the house's natural sound barriers, had been rendered effectively deaf to external assistance while remaining vulnerable to whatever horror had been prepared for him. Whimsy's examination of the study door revealed subtle but telling evidence of manipulation. The key, protruding from the inner lock, showed faint scoring around its shaft marks, consistent with fine wire having been used to turn it from the outside. "A technique requiring considerable skill," he observed to Bunter. "Our murderer possessed not only intimate knowledge of the house's acoustic properties, but also mechanical expertise of a high order." The combination of evidence began to paint a picture of elaborate preparation. Someone had spent considerable time learning the house's rhythms, testing sound, transmission, practicing furniture arrangement, and perfecting the mechanical aspects of their deception. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the village, Whimsy gathered his companions in the study for a final temporal reconstruction. Using various timepieces throughout the house, he began mapping the evening's events with mathematical precision. The hall clock maintains its own eccentric schedule, running some 10 minutes fast. He began, consulting his notes. The church bells struck true at midnight and 1 o'clock, confirmed by multiple witnesses. Yet our study clock stopped at 1:16, and Mrs. Pemberton heard no bells after midnight from her position in the back passage. The implications were troubling. If the professor died at 1:16, as the stopped clock suggested, why had the elaborate muffling been applied? If he died later, why stop the clock at that particular time? The temporal evidence seemed to point in contradictory directions. "The answer, gentlemen," 1. Whimsy announced with growing satisfaction, "lies not in when Professor Blackwood died, but in when someone very much wanted us to believe he had died. Our murderer has been playing games with time itself, a dangerous pastime when dealing with a man who devoted his life to celestial mechanics." As darkness settled over little Zodiac once again, Whimsy found himself contemplating the elaborate deception they were unraveling. Someone had orchestrated not merely a murder, but a temporal illusion designed to confuse both motive and opportunity. The question remaining was whether this elaborate chronological fraud was meant to provide an alibi or to destroy one entirely. The wind that had troubled the village seemed to whisper secrets as it stirred the yews around Blackwood House, and Whimsy suspected that before another dawn broke over little Zodiac, those secrets would finally demand to be heard. The revelations that emerged during the following morning's investigations proved coalescent, transformed Professor Blackwood from a simple victim into something far more complex, a man whose carefully constructed rational facade had concealed not one secret life, but several interconnected deceptions that would ultimately converge in his theatrical demise. Whimsy's systematic examination of Blackwood House's more obscure corners led them to a discovery that Mrs. Pemberton's efficient housekeeping had somehow overlooked, or perhaps deliberately ignored. Behind a false panel in the professor's bedroom wardrobe, accessible only by manipulating a hidden spring mechanism, lay a small study that bore no resemblance to the austere rationalism of his public workspace. The concealed chamber contained an extraordinary collection of materials that would have scandalized the Royal Astronomical Society: ancient grimoires bound in cracked leather, star charts annotated with Kabbalistic symbols, and an elaborate collection of mystical paraphernalia, including the very type of lantern they had discovered at the vicarage. Most significantly, a leather-bound journal bore an embossed symbol of a serpent consuming its own tail, encircling a stylized sun and moon. "My dear Bunter," Whimsy murmured, carefully examining the journal's contents, "our Professor Blackwood appears to have been living not merely a double life, but a triple one. Scholar by day, debunker by evening, and if these entries are to be believed, erstwhile mystic by midnight." The journal chronicled Blackwood's youthful involvement with a secret society during his student days in Heidelberg, the Order of the Celestial Reckoning, whose members practiced an elaborate form of astrological divination far removed from popular fortune-telling. The entries revealed a passionate young man, utterly convinced of cosmic influences on human destiny, who had achieved considerable rank within the organization under the mystical name Magister Saturnus. More intriguingly, the journal detailed his bitter conflict with a crack fellow initiate known as Astaroth, described as brilliantly charismatic but increasingly unstable, who had accused Blackwood of intellectual treason when he began questioning the order's practices. The final entries, dated some 30 years earlier, recorded Blackwood's complete renunciation of mystical pursuits and his vow to dedicate his life to exposing such dangerous charlatanism. The psychological complexity is rather staggering, Whimsy observed to Inspector Grimsby, a man who spent his later years debunking the very practices he had once embraced with religious fervor. The guilt and self-loathing must have been considerable, hence his particularly vicious attacks on contemporary astrologers. Their investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Evangeline Marsh, summoned by telegram from her Bloomsbury lodgings. The former governess proved to be a woman of faded respectability, whose recent correspondence with Professor Blackwood had been motivated by financial desperation rather than mere nostalgia. Her revelations about Timothy Blackwood, the professor's ward who had supposedly perished with his parents 23 years earlier, cast an entirely different light on the household's dynamics. The boy had not died in the railway accident, but had been raised by his guardian with characteristic emotional distance, developing what Mrs. Marsh delicately termed theatrical tendencies and an obsession with alternative identities. Timothy possessed remarkable gifts for mimicry and transformation, she explained, her nervous hands twisting a worn handkerchief. He could alter his voice, his bearing, even his apparent age with startling effectiveness. Professor Blackwood found such abilities distasteful and eventually sent him to a school that promised to discourage frivolous pursuits. The boy's disappearance during his final term had been quietly accepted by his guardian, who convinced himself that Timothy had chosen to reject his family obligations. More significantly, the professor had never reported the disappearance to authorities, allowing the world to continue believing the boy had died with his parents while quietly incorporating Timothy's inheritance into his own estate. Mrs. Marsh's most devastating revelation concerned recent events. Timothy Blackwood, now a man of 28 with considerable experience in theatrical work and what he termed mystical consulting, had contacted her 3 months earlier after reading newspaper accounts of his supposed death in biographical articles about his guardian. He was furious about being declared dead, demanding to know how his inheritance had been disposed of, Mrs. Marsh explained. He'd been supporting himself under various assumed names, developing quite a reputation in certain circles for his knowledge of esoteric subjects. He seemed particularly proud of a persona he'd created, some sort of mystical consultant with a foreign name. The implications struck Whimsy with the force of revelation. Timothy Blackwood, abandoned by his guardian and deprived of his inheritance, had not merely survived, but had transformed himself into exactly the sort of mystical charlatan his guardian spent his later years denouncing. More than that, he had somehow discovered his guardian's own occult past and chosen to exploit it with devastating psychological precision. The various threads of Professor Blackwood's complex life began weaving themselves into a comprehensible pattern. His youthful involvement with the order had provided him with intimate knowledge of mystical symbolism and psychological manipulation. His later career as a debunker conducted under the assumed identity of Rowan Lee had taught him the mechanical aspects of creating supernatural effects. His guilt over abandoning his ward had created a psychological vulnerability that could be exploited by someone who understood his deepest fears. Timothy Blackwood had become Astaroth, Whimsy announced with quiet satisfaction. The abandoned ward had transformed himself into the very nemesis his guardian had once fled from in Heidelberg. The Zodiac Letters weren't random threats but highly personal taunts, written in a code derived from their shared mystical background, designed to resurrect his guardian's deepest psychological terrors. The murder itself now revealed its true sophistication. Timothy, with his theatrical training and intimate knowledge of the house, had orchestrated not merely a death, but a complete psychological breakdown. The elaborate timing mechanisms, the muffled bells, the precise furniture arrangements, all were components of a ritual designed to convince Professor Blackwood that the mystical forces he had abandoned were rising to claim him. The crescent moon hatpin, belonging to Cordelia but used by Timothy, served multiple purposes. It implicated his cousin while simultaneously providing the symbolic punctuation for his revenge. The stopped clock, the aromatic pastilles, the lantern projection. Each element was calculated to strip away Blackwood's rational defenses and reduce him to the terrified mystical believer he had once been. The beauty of it, Whimsy observed with grudging admiration, lies in its perfect psychological precision. Timothy didn't simply kill his guardian, he forced him to die as the man he had tried so desperately to stop being. The ultimate revenge of the abandoned child, to make the parent confront their own deepest hypocrisy in their final moments. As afternoon shadows lengthened across little Zodiac, Whimsy found himself contemplating the cruel mathematics of family betrayal compounded over decades. The stars that had once guided Professor Blackwood's youthful mysticism had finally aligned for his destruction, not through cosmic influence, but through the very human forces of guilt, abandonment, and an abandoned child's patient, theatrical revenge. The wind that had troubled the village seemed to carry whispers of ancient secrets as they prepared for the final confrontation. And Whimsy suspected that before another dawn broke over little Zodiac, the true identity of Astaroth would finally be revealed in all its terrible, familial intimacy. The morning's investigations had yielded a harvest of contradictions that Lord Peter Whimsy contemplated with the satisfied air of a bibliophile, discovering a first edition misfiled among penny novels. The accumulated evidence suggested not merely a crime, but an elaborate deception whose very complexity had been designed to obscure its essential simplicity. Their return to Miss Briggs at the post office proved more illuminating than Whimsy had dared hope. The postmistress, when pressed about the chronology of the Zodiac correspondence, revealed a detail that transformed their understanding of the entire sequence. "You mentioned that one letter bore a crooked stamp," Whimsy began, his tone suggesting casual curiosity rather than systematic interrogation. "A trifling matter, unless one happens to be Miss Briggs, to whom postal precision represents a form of moral imperative." Miss Briggs compressed her lips with the severity of a hanging judge. "The envelope addressed to the vicarage, my lord, posted Wednesday afternoon by Mrs. Pemberton herself, who requested specifically that it be included in the afternoon delivery. Most irregular, as she typically handles the professor's correspondence through the morning post." "Mrs. Pemberton posted the vicarage letter?" Inspector Grimsby's pencil paused above his notebook. "Indeed she did, Inspector. I recall distinctly because the stamp was affixed sideways, most unprofessional, and there was an excess of gum that left a residue on the envelope's corner. When I mentioned the irregularity, Mrs. Pemberton seemed quite flustered. Confronted with this revelation at Blackwood House, Mrs. Pemberton's composure underwent the sort of systematic collapse typically reserved for poorly constructed alibis. Her initial denials gave way to reluctant admissions, each extracted with the patient precision of a dental surgeon removing an impacted tooth. "The professor instructed me to post it," she finally confessed, her hands twisting her apron with unconscious distress. "He said he wished to test the moral fiber of the parish, to flush out the author of these dreadful letters by demonstrating their methods to the vicar. It was meant to be a trap, my lord, to catch the charlatan in his own web." Bunter's systematic search of the professor's desk revealed the implement of this deception, a small rubber stamp bearing the symbol of Capricorn, hastily concealed in the second drawer. The ink pad showed recent use, and several practice impressions on blotting paper confirmed the professor's amateur attempts at mystical correspondence. "How delightfully ironic," Whimsy observed, examining the stamp with his magnifying glass. "The rationalist becomes the mystic, employing superstition to combat superstition. One begins to understand why our genuine correspondent found such tactics provocative. Their re-examination of the study revealed details that their initial shock at discovering the body had caused them to overlook. The missing coffee cup that Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned proved to be the first thread in unraveling a more complex domestic conspiracy. "You're quite certain the cup wasn't in the study when you found Professor Blackwood?" Whimsy pressed. "Absolutely certain, my lord. I noticed particularly because the saucer remained on the side table, but the cup itself had vanished. Most irregular behavior for the professor, who was meticulous about such matters. Bunter's examination of the kitchen revealed the cup in question, washed and returned to its customary position with suspicious efficiency. More significantly, a faint residue in the sink suggested hasty cleaning, designed to remove evidence rather than mere tidiness. The silver salver that typically held the professor's evening correspondence had similarly vanished from the study, only to reappear in the pantry among the household plate. Its surface bore traces of recent polishing that couldn't entirely disguise faint scorch marks around its rim. Their re-examination of the study revealed details that their initial shock at discovering the body had caused them to overlook. The missing coffee cup that Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned proved to be the first thread in unraveling a more complex domestic conspiracy. "You're quite certain the cup wasn't in the study when you found Professor Blackwood?" Whimsy pressed. "Absolutely certain, my lord. I noticed particularly because the saucer remained on the side table, but the cup itself had vanished. Most irregular behavior for the professor, who was meticulous about such matters." Bunter's examination of the kitchen revealed the cup in question, washed and returned to its customary position with suspicious efficiency. More significantly, a faint residue in the sink suggested hasty cleaning, designed to remove evidence rather than mere tidiness. The silver salver that typically held the professor's evening correspondence had similarly vanished from the study, only to reappear in the pantry among the household plate. Its surface bore traces of recent polishing that couldn't entirely disguise faint scorch marks around its rim. Their search of the professor's hidden study yielded the most significant discovery yet: a magic lantern of the type used for educational lectures, complete with a collection of glass slides depicting various astronomical phenomena. More ominously, one slide bore an image that had no place in any respectable scientific presentation. The slide depicted a figure of obvious occult significance, a composite of astrological and demonic symbolism that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the order of celestial reckonings, iconography. The image was labeled, in faded Gothic script, as Astaroth, herald of the final conjunction. "The professor's past returns to haunt him quite literally," Whimsy murmured, holding the slide up to the afternoon light. Someone with access to his hidden study discovered not only his mystical background, but also the very tools necessary to exploit it. The accumulating evidence pointed toward a conspiracy involving intimate knowledge of the time, his household's routines, access to the professor's private papers, and the mechanical skill necessary to manipulate timepieces and sabotage communication systems. Most significantly, it required someone who could move freely throughout the house without arousing suspicion. Mrs. Pemberton's role in posting the false vicarage letter revealed her as more than merely an unwitting accomplice. Her knowledge of the professor's mystical past, her access to his correspondence, and her ability to manipulate domestic evidence suggested active participation in a carefully orchestrated deception. "The question, Inspector," Whimsy said as they prepared to leave Blackwood House, "is whether our estimable Mrs. Pemberton was the architect of this domestic conspiracy or merely its most visible agent. The true puppet master, I suspect, remains carefully concealed behind the scenes." As afternoon shadows lengthened across Little Zodiac, Whimsy found himself contemplating the elegant complexity of the crime they were unraveling. The murder had been committed not by a single individual, but by a carefully coordinated alliance that combined intimate household knowledge with sophisticated psychological manipulation. The missing Timothy Blackwood, the supposedly dead ward who had transformed himself into the mystical consultant Sebastian Vale, had clearly orchestrated the elaborate mystical elements of the deception. But the domestic details, the manipulation of household routines, and the careful management of physical evidence required an accomplice with Mrs. Pemberton's unique position and knowledge. "We are dealing, Bunter," Whimsy observed as they walked through the village's winding lanes, "with a crime of remarkable sophistication, a collaboration between the theatrical and the domestic, the mystical and the mundane. Our challenge now is to determine which partner in this unholy alliance struck the fatal blow." The wind that had troubled Little Zodiac seemed to carry whispers of family secrets and domestic betrayals as they made their way back to their lodgings. Whimsy suspected that before another day passed, the carefully constructed web of deception would finally collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, revealing the true nature of the alliance that had brought Professor Blackwood to his dramatic end. The stars that had once guided the professor's youthful mysticism now seemed to mock his rationalist pretensions from the darkening sky, and Whimsy wondered whether the final revelation would prove that the greatest deceptions often spring from the most intimate betrayals. The invitation, dispatched by Bunter with his customary diplomatic precision, summoned the principal players to assemble in Professor Blackwood's study at 9 o'clock that evening. The hour, Whimsy observed with satisfaction, would allow the autumn darkness to provide proper atmospheric accompaniment to what he termed a modest demonstration in applied psychology. The study had been transformed into something between a laboratory and a theater. Heavy curtains drawn against the night created an expectant gloom, relieved only by the measured glow of gas lamps and a curious assemblage of apparatus that Bunter had arranged with reverent precision. The Turkish rug lay rolled back, exposing chalk marks that now gleamed with phosphorescent powder, creating an eerie geometry across the floorboards. Mrs. Pemberton arrived first, her black dress and rigid posture suggesting a woman steeled for judgment. Miss Cordelia Astley followed, her mystical jewelry catching the lamplight with nervous glints, while Sebastian Vale maintained the sort of theatrical composure that suggested either complete innocence or supreme confidence in his performance. Inspector Grimsby positioned himself near the door with characteristic patience, while Dr. Thornfield represented empirical science with his usual bracing skepticism. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whimsy began, settling behind the professor's desk with casual authority, "we gather to witness the final act of a drama that began not 3 days past, but 23 years ago, when a young ward named Timothy Blackwood supposedly perished in a railway accident that claimed his parents' lives. Sebastian Vale's carefully maintained composure flickered like candlelight in a draught. Your theatrical instincts do you credit, Lord Peter, but I fear you're confusing mystical consultation with melodrama." "Am I indeed?" Whimsy's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "Then perhaps you could explain why your lodgings contain identification documents bearing various names, including one passport issued to Timothy Reginald Blackwood, aged precisely 28 years. The silence that followed carried the weight of collapsed pretenses. Vale's shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time, his theatrical mask slipped to reveal the bitter young man beneath. "Very well," he said quietly. "I am Timothy Blackwood, the ward who was meant to die conveniently, leaving his inheritance to supplement his guardian's comfortable existence." Whimsy rose and moved toward an elaborate magic lantern that Bunter had positioned according to the chalk mark's precise geometry. From a black case, he produced the glass slide they had discovered in the professor's hidden study, the blasphemous image of Astaroth in all its occult horror. "The beauty of your plan, Timothy, lay in its psychological precision," Whimsy continued, adjusting the lantern's focus with practiced ease. "You understood that your guardian's rational facade concealed a man haunted by his mystical past. The Zodiac Letters were merely overture designed to resurrect his deepest fears and prepare him for the final performance." Bunter, with sacerdotal solemnity, placed upon a silver salver a pinch of brittle brown resin and lit a small spirit lamp beneath it. The familiar sweetish odor began to permeate the room, the scent that had clung to Professor Blackwood's clothing and study. "Benzoin and sandalwood," Whimsy observed, watching the aromatic smoke curl upward. "It soothes the spiritual lungs while playing havoc with rational thought. Combined with the isolation created by your sabotaged bell system, he demonstrated the neat wire loop and wooden pin that had silenced the professor's call for help. You created perfect conditions for psychological manipulation." With theatrical timing, Whimsy extinguished the desk lamp. The room shrank to the lantern's whispered breath, and then, with the decisive click of a shutter, the image blazed forth upon the far wall. Astaroth, composite and grotesque, ringed by zodiacal sigils, advancing as if from infinite night. Cordelia gave an involuntary cry. Dr. Thornfield muttered academic disapproval. Even Inspector Grimsby swore under his breath at the apparition's effectiveness. An image calculated to shatter a rationalist mind precisely prepared for shattering, Whimsy explained, as the demon wavered in the lantern's flame. Your guardian, isolated by sabotaged communications and overwhelmed by aromatic disorientation, found his abandoned mystical past rising to claim him. The projection appeared suddenly, silently, with terrifying clarity, exactly as Astaroth would manifest to the guilty consciousness of Magister Saturnus. Mrs. Pemberton's composure finally cracked under the accumulated evidence. "He promised me comfortable retirement," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Said the professor, "It had treated us both badly, that justice demanded we take what was rightfully ours." "Indeed," Whimsy agreed with gentle irony. Timothy required your intimate knowledge of household routines, your access to correspondence, and your ability to manipulate domestic evidence. The sabotaged bell, the adjusted timepieces, the careful management of physical traces all required an accomplice with your unique position and skills. The housekeeper's confession spilled forth with desperate relief. She had posted the false vicarage letter, manipulated the various clocks to create temporal confusion, and carefully removed incriminating evidence after the professor's death. Her reward was to have been a substantial portion of Timothy's reclaimed inheritance. Your plan possessed one crucial flaw, Whimsy continued, his gaze fixed on Timothy with prosecutorial intensity. You understood your guardian's psychological vulnerabilities perfectly, but underestimated the physical toll that absolute terror would exact upon a man of his age and constitution. Timothy's face had grown pale as parchment. I never intended murder, he said quietly. The projection was meant to force confession, to make him acknowledge what he had done to me. When his heart failed under the shock, you found yourself with a corpse instead of a confession, Whimsy finished, which necessitated the hasty improvisation of pinning Cordelia's hatpin to his waistcoat, creating theatrical evidence that would suggest supernatural intervention rather than mechanical trickery. From his pocket, Whimsy produced a coil of fine piano wire, weighted with a small lead pellet. The locked room presented no difficulty to someone with theatrical training. Observe, he demonstrated how the wire could manipulate the key from outside, turning the lock and creating the illusion of internal security. And of this, the faint scoring on the key's shaft bears witness to this mechanical seduction. Moving to the French mantel clock, Whimsy revealed the felt padding that had muffled its chime and the adjusted pendulum weight that had altered its rate. Time itself was conscripted into your deception, Timothy. Stop the clock at 1:16, muffle its voice, and bequeath posterity a persuasive fiction about the moment of death, while the whole clock's notorious inaccuracy provided contradictory testimony to confuse any investigation. As Whimsy concluded his demonstration, Timothy Blackwood seemed to collapse inward upon himself, the Sebastian Vale persona dissolving entirely. His confession, when it came, carried the bitter eloquence of 23 years' accumulated resentment. He abandoned me because my theatrical tendencies embarrassed his academic reputation, Timothy said, his voice breaking with suppressed emotion. When I disappeared from school, he didn't even search, simply allowed the world to believe I had died with my parents. For 23 years, I've been legally dead while he lived, comfortably on my inheritance. The wind that had troubled little Zodiac throughout their investigation seemed to whisper approval as Inspector Grimsby prepared to make his arrests. Whimsy found himself contemplating the cruel mathematics of family betrayal. The abandoned ward had returned to claim not merely his inheritance, but his very identity, using his guardian's deepest fears as weapons in a campaign of psychological warfare that had ultimately proven fatal. The stars, Whimsy observed as they prepared to leave the study, have indeed achieved their final conjunction, though I suspect Professor Blackwood would have found the mechanics rather more terrestrial than celestial in nature. The theatrical reveal was complete, but Whimsy suspected that the full implications of this domestic tragedy would continue to resonate long after the formal proceedings had concluded. The greatest deceptions, he reflected, often spring from the most intimate betrayals and the most patient. Revenge exacts its price not merely in death, but in the complete destruction of everything the victim had tried to become. Whimsy did not raise his voice. He merely let it cut through the tension, cool, precise, and, as ever, tinged with irony. You will forgive me a certain pedantry, Inspector. Crimes such as these are not mere acts of violence, but sonatas of deception. The interest lies in the development, not the theme. He paced the study, pausing by the bell pull. Let us begin with isolation. At 10:15, Professor Blackwood rang for service and received none. Mrs. Pemberton assures us the bell had developed a fault. Not so. A wire loop and a sliver of wood pinned the message in the servants' passage, and from that moment, the professor was as alone as Galileo on his tower. The house, with its books, heavy curtains and solid oak, swallows sound trapping him in a world where help could not reach. Mrs. Pemberton, pale and wringing her hands, barely whispered, He said it was for his own safety, Whimsy continued. Next, the geometry of the scene. The chalk marks beneath the rug are not the housemaid's guides, but the lines of a stage, meticulously drawn. The desk, the chair, the lantern, each aligned so that, at the groan of the conservatory door, which Gerald heard at 11:10, Blackwood would turn, and the past would leap out at him. The house, as any actor might envy, had rehearsed its part. He gestured to the salver. Then comes the scent, sweet, foreign, medicinal. Benzoin and sandalwood, purchased in quantities by a gentleman of theatrical habits. The residue clung to the professor's clothes, the curtains, the rim of this innocent silver tray. Mrs. Pemberton, you polished it, but the scorch remains a faint ring where a shallow brazier sat, filling the air with incense, thickening the senses, and perhaps hastening panic. Doctor, Thornfield interjected, you maintain that the scent alone? Not at all, Doctor. The resin does not conjure fear, it simply accelerates it. The real terror was psychological. The letters, with their occult sigils, were not random threats but triggers, each a spoonful of dread. They came from Mr. Timothy Blackwood, otherwise Sebastian Vale, who discovered in his reconnaissance the professor's secret history as Magister Saturnuses of the Order of Celestial Reckoning. Timothy, face drawn, eyes hollow, spoke quietly. He left me for dead. He stole my name, my inheritance. I survived as best I could, and when I found his hypocrisy, his mystical past, his rationalist present, I decided to make him face himself. But I never meant him to die. Whimsy nodded, his tone gentle but unyielding. The Zodiac Letters prepared the ground. The final act, a conjuration of guilt and memory, required only a lantern, a slide of Astaroth, and a man left alone with his past. The lantern, hidden in the wardrobe, was placed on the chalked mark. At the appointed hour, as incense thickened the air and the professor's nerves frayed, the image blazed forth. Astaroth, the Order's demon, returned to claim him. A whisper in the old ritual tongue, words only he and his betrayer would understand, and the heart, already worn thin, could bear no more. Inspector Grimsby, frowning, asked, "And the clocks?" "Ah, the clocks, faithless witnesses. The French mantle, with Mercury poised to flee with the minute hand, was stopped at 16 minutes past 1 by a sliver among the works. The bell was muffled with felt after the stoppage. The hall clock was made to run fast by padding the pendulum, ensuring all testimony about chimes would be unreliable. Time itself was drafted into the conspiracy, so that no one could be certain when the deed was done." He turned to Mrs. Pemberton. "The vicarage letter, with its crooked stamp and excess of gum, was your handiwork, posted at the professor's request to draw out his tormentor. But the baited trap only revealed his desperation, a clue Timothy seized upon." Mrs. Pemberton's composure finally broke. He said it was only to frighten him. "After all those years, I thought he owed us both something." Whimsy offered her a sad smile. "You managed the household, the evidence, the routines, the missing coffee cup, the polished salver, the bell, and the clocks. You were indispensable." He turned to Cordelia. "The hatpin left in the cushion after your quarrel was found stuck through the final letter into the professor's waistcoat. Not to injure, but to serve as a symbol, a red herring. You were meant to look guilty, but only in the most decorative sense," Inspector Grimsby asked. "And the locked room?" "An old trick, Inspector. A length of fine wire, weighted, sent under the door, looped to the key's shaft, turned from outside. The faint scoring is visible testament to theatrical training and patience." Whimsy looked at Timothy, who now seemed smaller, lost. "You wanted your guardian to confess, to admit what he had done. You chose the language of terror and the stage, but the heart chooses its own moment. You achieved not confession, but catastrophe. Bunter, ever practical, presented the will drawn up only last month, leaving Blackwood's fortune to a trust for abandoned children, Timothy included." The final irony hung in the air. Whimsy's gaze swept the room. "There is no devil here save the one we conjure from our own betrayals. Motive, a youth declared dead for convenience, stripped of name and inheritance. Means, the skills of a theatrical mechanic, allied to a loyal servant. Opportunity, a house designed for secrecy, a village unaccustomed to doubt, The letters, the lantern, the clocks, all instruments in a symphony of vengeance. Inspector Grimsby stepped forward. "Timothy Reginald Blackwood, also known as Sebastian Vale, I must ask you to accompany me to the station. Mrs. Pemberton, you as well." Whimsy, with a last glance at the moon-shaped hatpin on the desk, addressed Cordelia. "Let it remind you how easily the innocent become embroiled in others' dramas." He regarded the frozen clock, the silent room, the exhausted faces. Time resumes. The play is over. What remains is the customary postscript, and perhaps a night's sleep. The stars, poor things, must be exhausted by having their reputations so muddied. As the constable led the defeated pair from the study, Whimsy lingered a moment longer in the gloom, his silhouette outlined by the dying fire. "One sees now," he murmured, "that in such Gothic affairs, the only true horror is the persistence of memory and the ingenuity of the human heart to punish itself." The unmasking was complete, and in the hush that followed, even the old house seemed to exhale, as if relieved that its secrets had at last been spoken aloud. The custody room at little Zodiac's modest constabulary possessed the cheerless efficiency of a Methodist chapel, whitewashed walls, a scarred oak table that had witnessed decades of rural confessions, and chairs designed to discourage comfort. Inspector Grimsby installed himself with the satisfied air of a man whose patience had finally borne fruit, while Lord Peter positioned himself near the window where the autumn dusk provided appropriately Gothic accompaniment to the evening's revelations. Timothy Blackwood, no longer Sebastian Vale, mystical consultant, sat with the deflated posture of an actor whose final performance had concluded to scattered applause and general disapproval. The theatrical persona had dissolved entirely, leaving behind a young man whose carefully cultivated sophistication could not quite conceal the abandoned child beneath. "I repeat," Timothy said, accepting the cigarette Whimsy offered with hands that trembled slightly, "I intended no murder. The projection, the ritual terror, the carefully orchestrated psychological assault, it was meant to break his rationalist arrogance, to force acknowledgement of what he had done to me. When his heart failed under the shock, he drew deeply on the cigarette, using the smoke to blur the air between them like a stage curtain. One cannot murder a man with his own guilt." "Quite so," Whimsy replied with deceptive mildness, "though one might observe that mens rea is a prettier toy to argue over in chambers than in coroners' courts. The fact remains that calculated terror administered to a gentleman of 63 with a questionable cardiac apparatus is liable to move from metaphor into rather more concrete consequences." Bunter, with the reverent precision of a sacristan handling relics, produced a small evidence box containing the implements of Timothy's deception: the coil of piano wire used to manipulate the study door's lock, fragments of felt darkened with aromatic resin, and most damning, the magic lantern slide bearing the image of Astaroth. The slide's brass frame showed a distinctive crescent-shaped nick that corresponded exactly to the damaged point on Timothy's mystical ring. "The beauty of your plan," Whimsy continued, examining the evidence with professional appreciation, lay in its psychological precision. "You understood that your guardian's rational facade concealed a man haunted by his mystical past. The Zodiac Letters prepared the ground, but the final performance, the projected demon, the ritual incense, the carefully timed isolation, these stripped away his defenses with surgical accuracy." Timothy's composure finally cracked, revealing the bitter eloquence of 23 years' accumulated resentment. "He erased me as completely as if I had never existed. When I disappeared from school, he didn't even search, simply allowed the world to believe I had perished with my parents. For more than 2 decades, I've been legally dead while he lived comfortably on my inheritance, dismissing my very existence as an embarrassing inconvenience." The door opened to admit Mrs. Pemberton, escorted by a constable whose gentle manner suggested he found the arrest of the village's most respected housekeeper personally distressing. Her rigid composure, maintained through 30 years of domestic crises, had finally collapsed into something approaching hysteria. "I thought we were achieving justice," she whispered, her capable hands twisting her black shawl with unconscious desperation. "The professor was not. He was not a kind man, my lord. Demanding, critical, utterly indifferent to the welfare of those who served him. when Timothy explained what had been done to him, when he promised me security in my old age. She trailed off, perhaps finally understanding that good intentions provided cold comfort to the dead. Inspector Grimsby cleared his throat with official gravity. "There's another matter, Mrs. Pemberton. We've discovered that you posted the false vicarage letter at Professor Blackwood's specific request. He was attempting to flush out the author of the Zodiac correspondence by demonstrating their methods to the vicar." The revelation struck both conspirators with visible force. Timothy's cigarette burned forgotten between his fingers as he absorbed the implications of his guardian's counter-strategy. "He knew," Timothy said slowly. "He was trying to catch me." "Indeed," Whimsy confirmed. "And there's more. Mr. Pargeter has provided us with a draft of Professor Blackwood's recent will, a document establishing a charitable trust for abandoned children, with specific provision for one Timothy Reginald Blackwood, should he prove to be living. The inheritance you believed stolen was already destined to return to you through entirely legal channels. The silence that followed carried the weight of irreversible tragedy. Timothy stared at the evidence box, as though it contained the ruins of his entire existence, while Mrs. Pemberton's quiet sobbing provided a counterpoint to the wind that rattled the window frames. £8,000, Grimsby added quietly, plus accumulated interest. More than enough to establish the sort of mystical practice you'd envisioned, without the inconvenience of criminal proceedings. Timothy's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "So I have murdered him for an inheritance that was already mine, using knowledge he had abandoned in pursuit of rationalist respectability." The irony would have amused him, I think. He always appreciated elegant intellectual constructions. The formal arrests proceeded with the mechanical precision of English law. Timothy submitted to the handcuffs with theatrical resignation, while Mrs. Pemberton required physical support from the constable as the full implications of her situation became clear. As they were led from the room, Timothy paused at the threshold for one final observation. "You understand, Lord Peter, that this was never really about money. It was about acknowledgement, about forcing him to admit that I had existed, that my erasure had been a deliberate choice rather than mere oversight." "I understand perfectly," Whimsy replied, "though I suspect you'll find that acknowledgement, when it finally comes, proves rather more expensive than anticipated." The door closed behind them with Victorian finality, leaving Whimsy and Bunter alone in the custody room's cheerless atmosphere. Through the window, the lights of little Zodiac twinkled with deceptive innocence, as though the village had already begun the process of forgetting its brush with domestic Gothic horror. "A most instructive case, Bunter," Whimsy observed, gathering his gloves and cigarette case. "It demonstrates that the most devastating betrayals often spring from the most intimate relationships, and that revenge, however artistically conceived, invariably exacts its price from both performer and audience." "Indeed, my lord," Bunter replied with characteristic understatement. "Shall I arrange for our departure in the morning?" "By all means. Though I suspect little Zodiac will be discussing this particular conjunction of the stars for considerably longer than the celestial mechanics would strictly require." The wind that had troubled the village throughout their investigation seemed to whisper a final judgment as they prepared to leave, carrying with it the scent of autumn rain and the promise that some secrets, once revealed, can never again be hidden beneath the surface of rural respectability.